Welcome to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to give you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by Blue Blocks. Blue and green light is destroying our sleep, hormones, and performance, and that's why it's important to wear blue light blocking glasses. But did you know that all blue light glasses aren't created equal? I personally have started wearing Blue Blocks blue light blocking glasses, as they are the only blue light blocking company in the world that create evidence-backed lenses for filtering blue and green light. Their Australian lab-built lens technology is fitted into the most fashionable frames, and they even can make prescription and reading glasses in their optics lab. Whether it's their Sleep Plus glasses that block 100% of blue and green light, their Summer Glow mood booster glasses, or their blue light computer glasses, Blue Blocks has you covered. I wear my Sleep Plus glasses 2 to 3 hours before bed, and my sleep has never been better, and I feel so well rested. The daytime ones are also great at reducing digital eye strain, headaches, and lowering stress. With free and fast worldwide shipping using code SUPERHUMAN at checkout, now is an amazing time to level up your sleep and eye health. Just go to blueblocks.com, that's BLUBLOX.com, and enter code SUPERHUMAN to save 15%. Greetings, Super Friends, and welcome to this week's episode of the Superhuman Academy podcast. You know, I would have read one of your reviews out on the air, but unfortunately, I have run out. So if you haven't left a review, please take a minute. It just takes a minute, and we so appreciate it. On to today's episode, ladies and gents. Today, I was joined by Joe Sanok. He is a keynote and TEDx speaker, business consultant, and podcaster. He is the host of the #1 podcast for counselors, The Practice of the Practice, and has interviewed everyone from Pat Flynn to Lee Dumas, Lewis Howes, and many, many more. You've also seen him in PsychCentral, Huffington Post, Forbes, Good Magazine, Reader's Digest, Entrepreneur on Fire, and many, many more, in addition to writing his own 5 books. Now, I wanted to have Joe on the show because previously when I was on his show, he mentioned a couple of things that I didn't quite have enough knowledge about, things like family of origin, and I wanted to learn more. I wanted to have Joe on the show because he not only had a psychiatry practice, but also has built a business consulting other practices. Very, very interesting conversation ensued. We talked a lot about psychology and how really to engage in personal transformation. In other words, how can you completely reinvigorate and remodel who you are? I really enjoyed the conversation, and I know you will as well. So please enjoy my conversation on how to reinvent yourself with Joe Sanok. Mr. Joe Sanok, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing awesome today, Jonathan. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. It is a Thursday as we're recording this, which is my version of a Friday. We don't work on Fridays in Israel, so I'm pretty stoked. You're one of the last calls of my week. I'm pretty happy to be ending the week on a bang.
Yeah, we have that in common. I don't work Fridays either, so
awesome.
Look at us.
Tell me more about that. Why?
Yeah, you know, a number of years ago when I was working at a community college and then left kind of full time for podcasting and consulting, that first summer after I had left, it kind of hit me that even though I had been raised to work, 5 days a week and 40 plus hours, that I didn't have to follow that script anymore. And so my wife and I sat down and looked at the numbers and I said, what if I just took every Friday off over the summertime? And in college, I had done that where I scheduled all my classes to be, 4 days a week, except for one class that the only offering was an 8 a.m. on Friday. But other than that, I kind of had lived that life. And, even when I had a full-time job, I would really see if I could do extra hours during the week to have at least a lighter Friday. So that was always kind of something I liked. But then it really hit me that I could create kind of whatever schedule I wanted as long as it worked for the family. So we did an experiment for that summer to just try taking Fridays off, and it ended up working even better. I had more time for my health, more time for my family, for my relationships, and the income actually went up over that time. And then we stuck with that Fridays off. And then the next summer did another experiment to take Mondays off. So I'm down to Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as my work week.
That is awesome. I also I take Tuesdays off and obviously Fridays. I don't always take the Tuesdays off, but I try to take them off as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it just kind of frees up the brain to be able to really sort through what's important. And it also forces you to drop the ball on a number of areas where you say, is it worth it for me to be working on this, or should I just outsource it to somebody else? And it really forces you to only do what you're good at.
Well, and it's like Dan Sullivan says, an entrepreneur who's too tightly scheduled can't transform.
Absolutely.
So, Joe, tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do in your 3 days a week.
Yeah, so most of my career has been in the mental health space. I owned a counseling practice, a group practice, until 2019 when I sold that. And that was because I was growing in the podcasting world of helping mostly clinicians that own private practices, but also massage therapists, chiropractors, folks that they have really important work that they do, but they have no idea how to run a business. Mm-hmm. And so I help them kind of find that magical spot in their meaning where that also meets profits. And so we'll get going with their practice and grow that. But then more times than not, what happens is they then want to level up their big idea to kind of optimize things outside of just their practice to take that message to a broader audience.
Really cool. So you're really helping people help people, as it were.
Absolutely. And so to look at the multiplication effect of if someone goes from being a really good therapist that, say, helps couples, and then they hire 5 more therapists over a year, and each of those therapists now is seeing 20 or 30 couples a week, the multiplication effect of impact is just amazing to see on that individual person's life that owns the business, but also just in me feeling like I'm contributing to create a world that's better than I found it.
That's really cool. Now, did you feel limited when you were running your own practice? Was that a part of your decision to say, hey, I can only see so many people and I want to do something bigger, or was it a business opportunity? I mean, what drove you to change things up? And your podcast is called The Practice of the Practice. So what drove you to give up and sell the practice and work on the practice of the practice?
Yeah, I think it was a long decision because, so much of my professional identity was wrapped up in being a therapist. You go to grad school, I got a double master's degree, spent all this time, and my dad was a psychologist. So there was a lot of kind of emotional baggage there to let go of. But even when I started Practice of the Practice in 2012, I found that this thing that I thought was really ugly, the business world, actually wasn't. It was just kind of the lens I had seen it through. I had sold Kirby vacuum cleaners door to door, and it felt really slimy when I was in college. And that's all the business world that I had seen, is trying to sell vacuum cleaners that are $2,000 or $3,000 to someone that lives in a trailer park. And so for me, that was all I had seen. But then when I saw that, wait, these principles, if you apply it to something that is good and that actually helps the world, it's not the principles that are bad. It's actually, just the implications of them and how you implement them. And so as I learned more about just business and business strategy and started seeing results in myself and my consulting clients, I just was more and more interested in that and started to see fewer clients, built out the group practice where at the end I was seeing 1 or 2 clients a week. So it was really a natural transition, so much so that it was actually one of my clinicians that bought the practice from me, where she recognized it. She said, you're not really doing much counseling, and our lease is up, in 2019. Do you want to talk about selling the practice? And it was a great transition that we were able to make away from my clinical work into just kind of the business work.
Now, I want to ask around, Joe Polish always says success traps are harder to get out of than failure traps, right? It would have been easy to make that transition if your practice was completely failing and you're like, I need to eat, I need to find out another way. But I've found in my life, like whenever I want to make a change, especially a change with regards to my identity, and I ask you because you do have this background in training and education and you've done this yourself. What advice would you have for folks who are maybe sensing that they're up for an identity remodel or makeover and need to change the way that they see themselves from, for example, being a clinician to being an entrepreneur, or from being a student to being a professional, or whatever it may be? What's some practical advice that people can take for that kind of reinvention process?
Yeah, I think we first have to start with we're the first generation that really has this kind of option in regards to our career. When you think back in the 1800s, we all would have been whatever our mom or dad did. That would have just been kind of what our scripted life was. Even in the 40s and 50s, for most people, they weren't entrepreneurs. They weren't kind of pushing themselves to try something new. We really are the first people to be able to have those options. So the tension that we feel right now when we say, I want to reinvent myself, that's something new for humankind. And so the fact that we struggle with that is totally normal. The brain doesn't really know what to do with that. So I just want to start by normalizing that, hey, this is really new for humankind, and how cool that we get to be this first generation to, as a generation, say, well, do I want to do what I went to school for? Do I want to try something new? Do I want to do some life hacking to do something else? And so if we start there and then we say, okay, well, what do we know? Well, we know that the brain, it likes new things. It likes tension, but it also likes security and safety. I mean, you look at the hierarchy of needs, safety and security is number one. And so how do we do it in a way that optimizes our brain to then move us towards something new? Well, our brain needs to feel safe and secure while also moving towards something new. And so what I've found is, just like when I did the Fridays Off experiment, the highest performing people that I've interviewed, and we've done over 400 interviews through the podcast, is that they will do experiments instead of pass-fail. And so our current education system we all went through is a pass-fail mentality. It's meant to create factory workers. It's meant to have people that really don't ask big questions. And that's starting to shift with a lot of kind of the new forms of education. But if you were raised in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that education system really taught you to just kind of comply. And so when you move away from that pass-fail system and say, okay, I'm going to do an experiment and I'm going to get information from that about myself, but about my career, about my family, it takes away that risk where you can just say after 2 months of trying something new, okay, that really doesn't work for me. And so I really encourage people to have a maintenance goal. So with your own business, what are the things that you really need to do to just kind of tighten things up, to automate things outside of yourself? And then to have, some people will call it a stretch goal, a big idea goal, a risk goal. There's lots of ways that we can label it, but something that helps you push into something new. And so for myself personally, I always have one new project that I'm kind of pushing into and seeing if those clothes kind of fit for me. And then if it doesn't work with my community or if it doesn't work, with my audience, then I can always step back and then move into a different direction.
Wow, I'm so glad that we had you on the show today, because I personally am going through this right now of how much do I want to talk about learning in memory? And I'm, as you can tell, very open with my audience. How much do I want to talk about learning in memory after 7 years? Or how much do I want to go on to new topics, new ventures, new ideas, new products? I mean, is this the venture that I want to do it in, or should I start another company alongside it? And I love that idea, because, in our minds, it is pass fail. It's black or white. It's like I'm either super in love with what I'm doing right now, or I need to, do something else. And it's not. It's like, well, I could experiment for 2 months on developing, another podcast alongside this one. And if that doesn't work, it's totally cool, because I went into it saying it's an experiment. And I think a lot of times in my life, and I imagine in my audience's life as well, we don't look at it that way. It's not an experiment, and we look at it as like, dang, that was a really big failure.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people will do is they think that they have to start something brand new to change their identity. And that may be true. But I would say what I see work more often is more kind of adjusting an established river. And so you think about, moving a river over, 3 feet or 5 feet compared to digging an entirely new river. Moving an established river is going to be easier than it is going to be starting from scratch, because you have that momentum. And the same sort of thing has happened with Practice of the Practice. I totally screwed up in this. And that's why I'm telling you kind of from the other side, where I launched a podcast called How to Become a Consultant. And this was in probably 2014. I put kind of all my eggs into getting big influencers. So my first 3 people that I interviewed were Pat Flynn, Lee Dumas, and Chris Ducker. And I thought, if I get these big names, then this is going to be a huge success. It's going to be amazing. You can't fail with names like that. Did 80 episodes. And the first 15 were with those 3, because we did 5 episodes per consultant and dug really deep with them.
Wow.
And at the end of it, launched an e-course and 7 people bought it.
Oh, no.
So I spent all this time trying to build something new and had a vision for my audience becoming consultants. But what I had missed was that most of my audience was starting a counseling practice. Jumping to being a consultant was just too big of a jump for them. So I was completely starting from scratch. So what we shifted to doing was to really look at, well, if we say people that are scaling a practice, they're going to $1 million practice, and we have people that are just starting one, let's fill in that entire spectrum so that if someone is starting a practice, the natural next step is to go into our membership community. And then when they're there and they want to start a group practice, then they're going to step into doing one of our larger mastermind groups. And then it gets into a smaller mastermind group, and then individual consulting, and then done for you services. So we have things from free or $17 one-time fee all the way up to $20,000 products. So then I can shift into the things I'm excited about. A year ago, I ran 5 mastermind groups helping people launch their big ideas. And I realized that for who I am right now, that's not what I want. So when those mastermind groups closed, I didn't start new ones. Instead, I moved into Done For You podcasting because that's really exciting to help people launch podcasts for me right now. So I've still stayed within kind of the stream of private practice, but it's that continuation beyond you're starting a practice, you're growing it, you're scaling it. Now you're realizing I don't really want to be in the chair. I want to be out there telling big kind of words to the world and speaking and being on podcasts and all of that. So I then take my audience and say, here, I want you to follow where I've been, and we're going to do it together. And then I kind of pull them along that journey into the things that I'm interested in with an established audience.
Wow. This is really great and totally what I need to hear. And I imagine what a lot of people in the audience need to hear. And I think part of it, what resonates with me, if you're familiar with that idea of turning the flywheel, right? It's really hard to turn a flywheel the first time, but once you get it up and running, it's just keeping the momentum. And so what you want to do is, instead of turning the big flywheel to get started, is they give this example of fire bullets, not cannonballs, right? Like try little things out, go on a podcast, get interviewed a couple times, see if you enjoy the format before you launch your own, and dive in and realize like, oh, this isn't what I want to do. I think that's really sound advice.
Yeah, and I think it applies, because I know that you talk more than just business on this podcast. It applies to our everyday life too. And so for me, working out has been something that I've always wanted to get better at, and I've kind of tried some different things over the last year. So I read, Timothy Ferriss's 4-Hour Body, did some of that, signed up for a sprint triathlon last summer, and did the sprint try to see if I liked that. Found out that I hated it, and I'm never doing it again. But now I can say I'm a triathlete. And then I've kind of got into a rhythm now of what I do like. And so even in our everyday life, we sometimes feel like we have to create these big commitments to the world and put it on Instagram and then stick with it. And that's important to stick with things that are working. But I think that pass-fail mentality, to just go back to that and to say we're not a failure if we decide that we don't want to be a triathlete. I did it. I tried it, and it really isn't my jam. And so that doesn't mean that I'm lesser than. My family of origin story may kind of push back against that, and we can kind of deconstruct some of that as well today if you want to. But I think that even in our personal lives, pushing into new things and then pulling back from them, that's how we really can discover these things we've never even considered putting our time into.
Now, you, in our conversation, both during the recording and before recording, you've mentioned the idea of family of origin and that being a really important part of personal development. Elaborate on that for me.
Yeah. So our family of origin, and family doesn't have to be necessarily that you lived with just a mom and dad. It could be that you were raised by a grandparent, or maybe there's a close neighbor. Maybe you're part of a certain church community. And those things all impact us at a young age. Even if we think back to second or third grade. I mean, I can think about in third grade when this one girl, peed in the classroom because she lost bladder control. These crazy stories from our childhood, we remember really, really well. So you think about if there's a 5 or 10 year period of time that impacts us, I mean, it's our childhood. If I said to you, Jonathan, what happened when you were 27 years old, or what happened, when you were 21, you might have to kind of think through, where was I when I was 27? What was I doing? Whereas if I said, in 8th grade, who picked on you, that's probably going to come back a lot quicker. And so just Right? So those formative years, they teach us about the world, but they teach us in an inaccurate way. So, for example, I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school. My whole worldview until I was probably 15 or 16 was that there's kind of Catholics and then there's the rest of the world. Even so much that our teachers, when Catholic kids from public school would be coming for CCD classes on Wednesday, they would say, "Oh, those public school kids, they're going to steal your pencils and stuff. So make sure you hide your pencils."
Oh my God.
So this worldview that I received from teachers, from my parents, was a very specific worldview. Now, part of becoming an adult is to differentiate. And so, when teenagers start dyeing their hair blue like I did, or dyeing their hair like a cheetah print, that's differentiating from your family of origin. And so in my high school years, when the whole alternative 90s scene was big at Catholic school, I grew my hair out into a ponytail. I had a chain wallet, really differentiated from kind of the Catholic school football world that I was in. Now, what can happen, though, is we stunt that differentiation away from our family of origin. And so one thing that therapists are noticing right now is the purity movement that was really big in the 90s. Don't have sex until you're married. That was really big in evangelical churches. It was a very strong message in our culture. That differentiation away from that has been really hard for people in their 30s and 40s because it was such a pronounced message with so much shame around it. So therapists nationwide are seeing that there's tons of these kind of ex-evangelicals that are still carrying a lot of that baggage. And as a result, they have to kind of redifferentiate and rethink through who they are outside of their family of origin or their church of origin or the culture they were raised in.
Wow, I really like this, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart. Because my parents have, as every parent, they have views about the world and how trustworthy it is and how abundant it is that that are a source of conflict for myself and my parents. Because I have very, very vehemently kind of shed those views away. Do most people do this kind of naturally on their own, or is this something that a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with?
I think naturally in your kind of teen years and early 20s, if you go off to college and you start to meet people different than yourself, there's usually a pretty rude awakening of, wait, I feel like I was lied to, where the world isn't the way that I thought. So the natural kind of reaction oftentimes is anger or pushback or kind of moving away from your family. And then it kind of moves into often depending on how healthy the family is, philosophical debates, differences in politics or in religion between the parents and the adult child. But then what frequently happens is the adult child is then saying to their parents, "This is where I stand," and they're learning to more confidently stand in that position while not feeling they have to convince that other person to be like them. And so that really is a sign of maturity. Even just this past weekend, my wife's grandma died recently, and she was 97 and just an amazing woman that was kind of with it all the way to the end. So we were up celebrating her life, and my mother-in-law, after the funeral, like the day after, she's a strong evangelical, and she asked me, "So what do you think about the afterlife?" And when I asked for their daughter's hand in marriage, I was very much kind of in the evangelical camp. And so 15 years later now, quite a bit has changed for my wife and I, where we have a much different view of the afterlife and of God and all of that. And we had an honest conversation about it. And in the past, probably 5 or 10 years ago, I would have felt the need to kind of walk through why her version of the Bible wasn't necessarily the most accurate in regards to the culture or the Hebrew or the Greek and all those sorts of things. But instead, I realized and have been working on that really works for her. That gives her a sense of peace, a sense of what the universe is. And it's not my job to help her change. And if she wants to ask questions and hear my point of view, that's awesome. But really, there's not a need for me to put that wedge in our relationship. She's asking about my point of view, and I'm sharing my point of view without going into it saying, I need to have you also align with my point of view.
All right, let's take a quick pause because I want to let you know about a product that I have been really enjoying recently, and that is Ambro Greens by Ambronite, their latest product, which makes it easy to get all of your nutritional bases covered with just 1 teaspoon in cold water. You literally can't make it any easier, and along the way, you will improve your digestion and gut health, put an end to cravings and weight gain, boost your immunity, and I've noticed that you'll get a lot more energy out of your day with all of the amazing nutrients, vitamins, antioxidants, etc., etc. So I partnered with Ambronite to give you an amazing opportunity to try their product out for just $9.90. All you need to do is visit ambronite.com/superhuman. That's AMBRONITE.com/superhuman. All right, let's get back to the episode. I wonder if there's any exercises, that people can do to kind of get a feel for, because I think if people are struggling with this, they probably already know it, right? I've found, especially in matters of psychology, that someone will be exposed to an idea or a concept like we're talking about right now, like, having a conflict with your parents' beliefs, and all of a sudden they'll see themselves in that. From my experience, and maybe this is just myself and the work that I've done to be more self-aware, but I rarely need someone to go, oh, and by the way, you suffer from this as well. So if there are folks in the audience who are saying, maybe I do have some beliefs from mom and dad around love that I don't really want to be carrying around anymore, what can people do practically to bring that to their attention and shift that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give a couple book recommendations that I think are helpful, and then we can talk through some exercises as well. So if you're in a relationship with somebody, the book 8 Dates by John and Julie Gottman is just an amazing book. John Gottman's been studying marriage for 40 years, and with, I think, 97% accuracy, can predict whether or not people will get divorced within a 15-minute period of time. The guy's just a ninja when it comes to figuring out why people stay together or don't. And so even if you're in a long-term partnership or a long-term relationship, this book's really applicable. In that book, the very first chapter is all on trust and commitment. And when my wife and I did that first date, we realized from one question just how different our family of origin is. And it was a game changer for us. And so the question was, what did trust and commitment look like in your family of origin? And so for my wife, her mom and dad would cuddle every night. Her dad would give a foot rub to her mom almost every night. They would often hold hands, all sorts of things. Whereas in my family, my parents were often at odds. They were strong, good parents in a number of ways. But sometimes it felt like love and commitment is putting up with someone you don't really want to be around. And so to just have those two very different versions of trust and commitment helped us as a couple say, well, for me, I feel like if things are clicking along and we're not fighting, we are doing awesome. Whereas she's like, why am I not getting a foot rub every single night? And so it's one thing to say to our parents, I want to differentiate from you, but it's a whole nother thing for a loved one, a spouse, a partner to recognize just how big of a gap there is between the two of you. So that'd be one book. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
I definitely can resonate with what you're saying, because I think one of the only times in life, right, that we're ever accepted into another family fully. I mean, we all have mentors, we have aunts and uncles, but I mean, to be in another family, and this is obviously in an ideal world, is when we get married and all of a sudden we're part of a new family in a way that we were never able to be before. And that's been really eye-opening for me as well. Just seeing, first off, my wife has siblings and I don't. So they're a larger family, and it's just so interesting how dynamics change, and trips are different when it's not an only child situation, but also what does loving relationship look like has been really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think that we often think we have to change that family to us, or we have to help our spouse see our point of view. And that's where I think the second book really comes in. And I've been actually reading through this book for my own personal development recently, and it's called How to Be an Adult in Relationships. And it comes from a Buddhist standpoint, but it's applicable to everybody. And the whole idea of non-resistance. And so what that would look like in my marriage, before this book and before I started doing some of this internal work, was, say Christina said, you know what, I think this weekend we should just lay low. We should be home. We should just relax. And I'm more of kind of the active parent oftentimes where I'm like, no, we should go do something and be exciting. And we might get in I wouldn't say a fight, but at least kind of a conflict over what the weekend would look like. And then when she pushed back with resistance, I would get in debate mode and kind of say, well, here's all the reasons that it's good for kids to be outside. It's good for kids to feel social. It's good to feel all these different things. So this book really pushes into non-resistance and to really understand kind of what their motives are, what they're trying to communicate, but then also to slow down and not push back as hard. And it's been interesting to see, as I've not pushed back as hard, at least in my relationship, how much that's caused Christina to have to then examine her own kind of motives because I'm not fighting. So then it's like, well, I'm left with myself now. And so that's a really good book for anyone that wants to feel more grounded in kind of who they are. It's an older book, so I think there's only used copies of it out there on Amazon, but it's definitely worth picking up because those exercises within those two books both really help you understand yourself, but even more importantly, how you relate to others and then kind of what the ramifications are of that relation to others.
Yeah, and I'm taking note that a lot of the exercises are actually in regards to relationships, and I wonder if part of that is because that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? When you build a life with another human being is really when you need to confront and make some serious decisions about like how you want to be in the world, especially if that relationship is one that plans to bring other people into the world.
Yeah, well, and even if you don't have a significant other, you still are in relationship with other people. And so being able to depersonalize how other people act is really important as an adult to be able to discover who you want to be. So, for example, if I'm flying with a friend down to Florida, for example, if we fly out of Traverse City where I live, they are all smaller airlines. And so most of the time you have to gate check your carry-on luggage, which means you have to wait for 5 to 15 minutes to get that luggage on the other end. So say I was traveling with a friend and we have a close connection and he decides to bring a, carry-on luggage that I know he's going to have to gate check, but we have a close connection. Now I could get all worked up over the fact that, it's going to be late or why are you doing this? Why didn't you just check it? But if I go into that a little bit more grounded, I can look at all the options that I have. Okay, I have the option to stay with my friend and wait for his luggage. I have the option to go to my plane, and if it comes, then I have the option to get on it or to wait for my friend. If we miss our flight, then we can make the best of it or we cannot. I don't have to personalize it that he's somehow trying to ruin the trip if he's bringing on carry-on luggage. And so just being able to slow down that process a little bit and realize that most people's behavior isn't aimed at hurting us, even if it feels that way. Right.
Absolutely. I think there's so much value in that. And just, it is interesting because I often do think, and maybe you have an opinion on this, but like, I really do think the success of our relationships, especially romantic relationships, has really more to do with us than the person across from us, right? In my case, like getting into a healthy relationship was really about doing the work and becoming the right kind of person.
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand your role in it. There's a book called The Scream-Free Marriage, which it's not anti-fighting in a marriage, but the idea is really to kind of own your own role in a marriage in particular. And in that book, he talks about how marriage is like a campfire, that if you change one element, if you change the wood or the air or the spark, it's going to change the entire campfire. And so if the dynamic within a partnership isn't working, just one person changing is going to change the relationship. Now, you being more assertive or you stepping back more or whatever the thing is that you want to step into, who knows what your partner is going to do to react to that. But then it reveals what's happening. And so, for example, I realized over probably the last 6 months of working with my therapist that I really am a pursuer in regards to the relationship. So I'm the one that's looking to hold hands, looking to cuddle, I love you and wanting that I love you back. And just realizing if I am the glue that holds our relationship together, and if I step back and it falls apart, that's a really big problem. That's not a relationship. That exposes that Christina wasn't necessarily as invested. And so over the last probably 3 months, I've stepped back a little bit in regards to being as much of a pursuer. And then she has stepped forward. Now that was a gamble. She could have just, stayed where she was. But those sorts of things in working with a therapist or in, kind of doing your own work can help you understand these habits that for you feel very true, but maybe you should push back on and say, well, is this really how I want to be relating with my partner or relating with my friends and family?
Really, really cool. Now, Joe, we've burned through a majority of our time already, and I still haven't had a chance to ask you. I mean, you've interviewed 400 of the world's top performers. What's some of the things that have stuck for you? What are some of the hacks, tips, tricks, habits that you take advantage of to perform at a high level?
Yeah, I think that one of the commonalities that I see is the ability of people to slow down so as to speed up. The amount of clarity people get from slowing down is just amazing. I mean, you look at Bill Gates and Warren Buffett when they were on the Larry King show, they both were talking about how they have major parts of their week that are just for thinking. Bill Gates has a week every year called Think Week, where he goes to a cabin by himself with a bunch of books. We host a conference called Slow Down School, where for 2 days we go hiking. We have massage therapists and a yoga teacher on the beaches of northern Michigan. And then the last 3 days we run full tilt towards the business and the big ideas. And to see the things that get shed by just slowing down, and those parts that really come to the surface and say, wait, my big idea really needs to be this one thing, not these 5 kind of pieces of spaghetti I've been throwing at the wall. It's amazing to see. And every single year we do it, it happens where the clarity that comes through slowing down. So I would say that. And I would say, I think it's Tony Robbins who often says, and I'm not sure if he's quoting someone else, that, someone that's healthy has 1,000 dreams, but someone that's not has only one. Being somebody that has had back surgery, I had back surgery when I was 20 from a snowboarding accident. My back is always kind of on the brink of a flare up. So just even regular exercise for me and getting into that to avoid a flare up, it makes life just easier. And so these top performers realize that, whether it's nutrition or working out or meditation or relationships, all these things that we know the happiness research points to, that those are important to make you more effective in your business and your life.
I love that. And that's one that I don't hear enough. We hear meditation, we hear exercise, but hearing the slowing down is a really important one. And as I said, I'm striving to take more free days. I've recently decided to allow myself to take thinking time. Keith Cunningham just wrote this book, The Road Less Stupid, and it talks all about the importance of thinking time. Like, set aside an hour, just sit down with a pen and paper and think. None of us ever do this anymore because we're 24/7 stimulated and we are not capable of being with our thoughts anymore. But I've finally accepted that I can do that, and that doesn't need to be in my free time. That is actually focus time. That's productive time. That happens during work days, and carving out the time and putting it on the calendar, because it's just as important, if not more important, than answering your frickin' emails, which are just a distraction.
Absolutely. And your emails are, someone else saying, I need something from you. It's not you kind of determining it. So yeah, I think that idea of thinking time, and even when you are present with a friend or a family member. So every night I put my daughters to bed. That's kind of my role, and my wife helps out a little bit with that, but she's usually packing up lunches. Now, I could, while I'm reading to my daughters, be thinking about, okay, I have all these other things to do tonight, or tomorrow I'm going to be doing these podcasts, but then I'm really losing that moment with them. I was just listening to The Armchair Expert, and Sam Harris was getting interviewed on that by Dax Shepard this morning, and Sam said, you don't become happy, you just are happy. And so the idea of being happy in the moment, I think is really hard for a lot of us, because that whole fear of missing out, or I want to be on social media or scrolling through TikTok or whatever it is that, people are getting sucked into, you're taking away from your moment when you're doing that.
I could not agree more. I do want to touch on one other thing you mentioned. You mentioned you are working with a therapist. Obviously, you have the knowledge yourself, and you've run practices and you consult practices. I think that's really cool. And I want to go into that, and I want you to share the logic behind that, because I think a lot of people, my father always said, I don't understand why people go to therapy. You should be smart enough to solve your own problems. And yet here you are talking about, by the way, your family of origin stories. Here you are, you've done the work, you've been there, you are a clinician, and yet you see a therapist. So talk me through that.
Yeah. So we see a marriage therapist as well as I see my own therapist. And I think for me, it's having that external perspective to really sort through things. We don't have some major issues. It's not like one of us had an affair or anything that most people would maybe start up therapy for. It's really meant to be preventive and to help us optimize our marriage. And for me, it's been more about learning how much I need to step back. And so, for example, on the Enneagram, I'm an achiever. My wife, she's a peacemaker. So if we think about what does a peacemaker need to do if they really want to feel more like an adult, well, they need to disrupt. They need to push back against that peacemaking, because when there's conflict, Christina will stuff that down. She'll just leave it there and then grow resentment because she wants there to be peace, because that's her kind of main thing that she values. Whereas for me as an achiever, I want to get things done. I want the checklist. I want to know, exactly what's going to make the best marriage and the best whatever, and it becomes obsessive at times. So what does an achiever need to do to kind of become more of an adult? Needs to stop achieving and step back and chill out.
Yep.
And so having a therapist say to me in the couples counseling, you know what, Joe, you really have nothing to do right now for the marriage. And Christina needs to speak up more. And then we'll talk about how you guys respond to that. That's terrifying for someone that's an achiever to say you have nothing to do. It's like, no, I want a book to read. I want a checklist. I want a podcast. And realizing how much of me sending her podcast, oh, this is a great podcast on this, is me again leading that process rather than letting her become the disruptor and her become the person that she wants to be. So then in my own individual therapy, working with my therapist on family of origin issues, where does that achieverness come from? There's obviously benefits to that, but then there's also a lot of things and a lot of baggage where if external validation is always the thing that makes me feel good about myself, that's a terrible way to live. And that's not anything I have control over if people affirm me or don't affirm me. And so he's a Buddhist therapist and has been practicing meditation for 25 years. So just having that perspective of kind of yes and it can be that you're an achiever, but you also in that don't have to give that up, but you can also chill out a little bit. So I love having that external perspective to just help me sort through what I'm thinking and what I want to get out of life.
It's quite funny. Your marriage sounds a lot like my marriage, and your therapist sounds a lot like my therapist. Where awesome. What we talk about is, well, why do I feel the need to help so many people and achieve, and what am I trying to make up for, and what trauma am I trying to heal by showing the world how good I am and how much I can do for others and how much I can serve others. That comes from trauma. And so when I do make the time to go there, that's what we work through.
Yeah. The worst and the best statement that my therapist said to me was, what if you never found another life hack? And I was like, are you kidding me? Of course I want to optimize life and get the most out of it. I want to have every moment be the best, that by, the time I die, people say that guy lived 5 lifetimes in one lifetime. But then we kind of deconstruct that and say, where does that come from? Why is that important to you? And, those questions that I would probably just ignore if I just sat and thought about it by myself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Joe, we have now come up on time, and I do want to give you an opportunity. Where can people check you out and learn more about all the amazing stuff that you're doing?
Yeah. So if you are a counselor, a coach, have some sort of private practice, then the Practice the Practice podcast or our website, practiceofthepractice.com, is the best place to go. We have live chat there with my assistant, Jess, so she can point you in the right direction. If you're someone that is looking to level up and have a big message for the world, we have podcastlaunchschool.com, and we have a 9-part email course that's all about kind of the first things to think through before you launch a podcast. So whichever one of those suits your fancy, head on over to there.
Really brilliant. And Joe, before I let you go and thank you for your time and your wisdom today, if people take away one big message from this episode and they carry it with them for the rest of their lives, what would you hope for that to be?
I mean, I think it's something that I as well need to hear, and that's that you are enough and you have the skills you need to help the world.
That's a beautiful message to end on. Mr. Joe Sanok, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I really appreciated it, and I know my audience learned a lot as well.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Thanks for tuning in to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit superhuman.blog. While you're at it, please take a moment to share this episode with a friend and leave us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week.